good reason. So he comes up with this plan. He proposes to Congress a change in the law so that for every justice of the Supreme Court who reaches the age of 70 and who doesn't retire on his own, the president should get to appoint one new one. That's the so-called Supreme Court packing scheme. If he had secured it within the next 2 years, he could have appointed 5 new justices to the court, thereby packing it and probably bringing back all that New Deal stuff. This was the first major political battle that he lost. His own party turned against him. But for the months of 1937 that this kind of hung over us, it was a contributing factor. People who had any money to invest, whether they be American or from overseas, they took a look at this and they said, oh, we're holding off, or we're getting out. Because if he gets this, all that New Deal stuff's coming back again. So that was a contributing factor that ultimately worked in our favor because it was rejected. The second factor that explains the 37 collapse was the undistributed profits tax. When a company makes a profit, it can distribute some to its shareholders, it can retain the rest, retain earnings. Very good and important source of capital and for growth of the company when it retains some of those earnings. But by 37, Roosevelt's coming under the influence of people like John Maynard Keynes, who had just published his general theory the year before. And the argument now that he hears all the time is, we're not spending enough. We need to spend more. He just doubled federal spending in his first term. But now the theory is, well, the economy's slack because we have to make up for low demand by government spending more. And they looked around for ways to do this, and they thought, well, hey, we can always force people to spend more. Look at these corporations. They don't give all their profits to their shareholders, who would then in turn spend it. They retain some of this. Well, it wasn't as though they were putting it in their mattress. But they thought, well, let's have some change in the law that deters business from retaining its earnings so that they have incentive to give it to their shareholders as much as possible and let them spend it. So he proposes a tax on undistributed profits or retained earnings of 85%. Now just imagine, I mean, the economics of it is bad enough, but think of the morality of it, and the hypocrisy, the arrogance of it. Here's a guy who says, you know, I'm still getting a monthly allowance for my mother, which he was through until she died in his, I think, 3rd term. I never started any business. I didn't take the risks that you guys had. I didn't make any of this money. But if you keep it, instead of distributing it to your shareholders, I want 85% of it. Not conducive to investment, risk-taking, new employment, business expansion. But it's symptomatic of what Roosevelt was doing throughout his presidency. Before he's done, the top rate that he criticized Hoover for taking from 24 to 65%, you know what it'll be by the time Roosevelt's done? 91%. At one point, he proposed to the Congress a 99% top income tax bracket. They rejected it because some congressmen said, a couple of them from the Midwest said, we come from states that have 2 or 3% state income tax. If he takes 99, how's my state going to get its 2 or 3? Won't be anything left. So they rejected it, and then in retaliation against Congress, he imposed by executive order a 100% income tax rate on all incomes over $25,000. If that had ever been challenged in court, I'd like to think any jurist worth his salt would have thrown it out, because presidents can't raise income tax rates on their own, but that's what he tried to do. Congress very quickly, however, voted to repeal that executive order. They took it off the books before it could do real damage. But that's what he was trying to do. So you wonder why didn't investment take off during Roosevelt's presidency? Because he has a war on it. Because he wants you to take all the risk while he takes almost all of the reward. Well, the Wagner Act, though, mainly explains the 37 collapse. This was formerly known as the National Labor Relations Act, informally called Labor's Magna Carta. It created the National Labor Relations Board that we have to this day, which takes disputes between labor and management out of the ordinary courts of law and puts them in front of the politically appointed category of law that is dealt with that way. Everything else, you know, we have courts. Labor management disputes, oh, well, the president should get to appoint a panel and they'll settle those disputes. And of course, they heavily reflect the political complexion of the president who appoints them. Right now, we have a very left-leaning NLRB because of Obama appointments. Well, this is the source, this act is the source of exclusive representation for organized labor, of mandatory collective bargaining, once you get 50% plus one to vote in a union election. It gives enormous new powers to organized labor, breeds a wave of militancy across the country. This is the time of the sit-down strikes and the auto plants, raising uncertainty and leading to some violence on both sides, and a great deal of loss of confidence in enterprise, soaring costs of business. The number of man-hours lost to strikes from 36 to 37, just 1 year's time, more than doubles because of the impact of the NLRA, National Labor Relations Act. Some of these powers for organized labor, Congress will later whittle away. Not nearly enough. We're still working on it, but in the 40s, for instance, Congress will pass Taft-Hartley that gives states the right to pass right-to-work laws. Georgia has one. Indiana just passed one that basically say no worker in our state can be compelled to join or pay dues to a labor organization as a condition of employment. It doesn't outlaw unions. It just says that they got to earn their keep instead of confiscating it. But in 37, this was very, very harmful. The American economy will limp along without any dramatic improvement in that very important measure, unemployment, until the war, which for us begins in December of 41. It gives rise to the common misconception that it was the war that finally got us out of the Depression. Implicit in that, by the way, is the admission that it wasn't Roosevelt, so you're making progress, I guess, if you at least get to that point. Wars sometimes give you a bit of a lift, but not because of what we're doing, not because we're blowing things up, but because of the way they're financed. You get a monetary stimulus, you get lots of money creation because government's financing its war effort by revving up the printing presses. You get a lift in the short run from that sometimes, but it's at the expense of the long run and the value of the currency and the next bust will we pay for it. If you look at the unemployment rate, it's true that it fell dramatically into single digits by 1942, maybe 43 at the latest, from above 20% shortly before down to real low. But the reason for that, more than anything else, is we took 11 million men out of the workforce. And we sent them overseas, so they're not counted, and we paid them a fraction of a market wage to do something else. So yeah, unemployment will fall, but what about general standards of living? They don't improve in the 40s. By some measures, in fact, you could argue that we were worse off in the war years. Instead of making refrigerators and automobiles, consumer products, we were making guns and planes and tanks and blowing things up. Necessary for the war effort, but that's not the same as saying it's what gives us our standard of living. We really didn't see recovery until after the war in standards of living. And this runs counter to a lot of conventional wisdom. And we had, after World War II, that ends in 45, the biggest reduction in federal spending in our history. Keynesians tell us that, well, when the government spends more, it stimulates, but when it spends less, that hurts the economy. Well, we had a massive reduction in federal spending in 45, 46. We didn't have a bust. We had a boom. They're connected because when the government takes less, when it commands fewer resources, it's another way of saying more is left for those who know how to spend it better. We also had in 45, signed by President Truman, because Roosevelt dies in April of 45. A reluctant President Truman signed into law the biggest reduction in the corporate income tax in maybe ever. In one fell swoop, the top corporate income tax rate in 45 goes from 90% to 38%. So let me ask you, if you're a businessman, would that make